Hey, King's Cross.
Happy Sunday, King's Cross.
Hello, everybody. King's Cross. Happy Sunday.
How's everyone? I'm missing everybody. Lucy wants to say hello too and wave to you.
We miss you, King's Cross.
Happy Sunday!
Hey everybody, welcome to worship. Pastor Scott here. I'm so glad that you found us and are joining us for our virtual worship here today as we take our next step, our second week in the book of Jonah. We'll be in Jonah 1, 4 through 16, and we'll even talk about who those young kids are over my shoulder. That's Joy and I from almost 10 years ago now. We'll talk about that here later on. Before we go any further, let me just offer a word of gratitude and happy Mother's Day. I'm so grateful, so thankful for all of you who have devoted so much of your lives to caring for and helping grow and raise others, whether they are your biological children, your adopted children, your spiritual children. So many of us are who we are today, thanks in large part to mothers who loved us into being. So happy Mother's Day, and thank you to all the mothers out there watching. Let me also just draw your attention to the fact that earlier this week, I sent out a church-wide letter detailing some of the next steps we're taking as we prepare to return to in-person gatherings. Those are still a few weeks away as we make preparations to gather safely together. I'll have a lot more specific details to share with you in the days and weeks ahead, but please know we have been and continue to be hard at work preparing, eagerly awaiting that return to in-person gatherings. If you didn't get a copy of that email, head over to our website, kcc.church. You'll find a link on the front page to our coronavirus hub, and there's a copy of the letter there. Just know, again, we're working hard and looking forward to being back together soon. Thank you as well for those of you that continue to give during this time. Not only do your gifts make our virtual ministry possible right now, but they lay the groundwork for us to get back together soon and effectively as we resume in-person gatherings here in a few weeks. So thank you. Your generosity means so much to me, and it makes our work together possible. If you want to join us in that common work through giving, please know right now there are 3 great ways to give. You can go to our website, kcc.church/give, give through our online giving portal. You can give through your bank's online bill pay, and you can give through the mail. And of course, as we resume in-person gatherings here in a few weeks, you'll be able to give in person. Know that we love you and miss you, or can't wait to be back together soon. But until then, stay well and stay safe. Let's continue now in worship.
Let our praise be welcome. Let our song be a sign that we are here for you. We are here for you. Let your breath come from heaven, fill our hearts with your light. We are here for you. We're here for you. We are here for you. To you our hearts. To you our hearts are open. Nothing here is hidden to you. Our one desire. You alone are holy, only you are worthy, God, that should fight for down. Let our shout be your your word move in power. Let what's dead come to life. 'Cause we are here for you. We are here for you. To you our hearts. To you our hearts are open. Nothing here is hidden. You are our one design. You alone are holy. Only you are worthy, God. Let your fire fall down. To you our hearts are open. Nothing here is hidden. You are our one desire. You alone are holy. Only you are worthy, God. Let your fire fall down. Let your fire fall down. We're here for you. And we welcome you with praise. We welcome you with praise. Almighty God of love, we welcome in this place. We welcome you with praise. We welcome you with praise.
Simply restoring, The kingdoms now become my own, and in the King I found a home.
Hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. Hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest friend, but only trust in Jesus' name. Christ alone, cornerstone, the weak made strong in the Savior's blood. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. Darkness seems to hide His face. I rest on His unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. My anchor holds within the veil. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love, and through the storm, that He is Lord, Lord of all. He is Lord, Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love, and through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. He shall come with a trumpet sound. Oh, may I live in You be found, dressed in His righteousness alone, faultless stand before the throne. cornerstone, the weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, when He is the Lord, Lord of all. In Christ alone, cornerstone, the weak made strong in the Savior's love. And through the storm, and He is Lord, Lord of all. He is Lord, Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, the weak made strong in the Savior's love. And through the storm, He is the Lord, Lord of all. Sings my soul, my Savior God, to Thee. How great Thou art! How great Thou art! Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to Thee. How great Thou art! How great Thou art!
Well, I'm so glad that you're here and that you're joining us for our second study in the book of Jonah. We'll be in Jonah 1, 4 through 16 if you want to go ahead and turn and swipe over that direction. As you're doing that, let me remind you that last week we covered a lot of ground in terms of background for the Old Testament. We talked about the three different portions of the Old Testament, how Jonah is a part of the book of the 12 minor prophets that are part of the larger prophetic literature in the Old Testament. And we covered a lot of ground as well about the history of the formation of the Bible, the Old Testament, the formation of the separate kingdoms, the divided kingdoms, and how that impacts a lot of the context of what's going on in Jonah. If you didn't get a chance to watch that last week, or maybe you're just a little fuzzy, it was a bit like drinking from a fire hose, then I've put together a little bit of a Jonah cheat sheet with some of that, the bullet points listed in order. You can find that on the website. I'd encourage you to snag that or maybe refresh yourself with that as we go along. Here's the big thing that we need to remember from last week, which is about our context. Jonah takes place during a time of the divided kingdoms. So under Saul, David, Solomon existed the unified kingdom of Israel. But for much of the Israelite history, at least the monarchical history where they had kings, it existed in two different kingdoms. There was the northern kingdom of Israel. It was made up of 10 of the 12 tribes. And then you had the southern kingdom of Judah, where Jerusalem existed. Now, a lot of us know about the Babylonian capture, the captivity. That took place in the southern kingdom after the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians. And so Jonah is taking place when Jonah is being asked to go to Nineveh. Nineveh is the capital of the Assyrians, or perhaps not yet the capital, depending on when Jonah takes place. We're not 100% sure on the date that Jonah's story takes place. But if it's not yet the capital, it's a large cosmopolitan city. So Jonah is being asked to go to one of the main cities of his country, his kingdom's enemies. That's where so much of his reluctance likely comes. So just keep that in mind. We talked about in the first 3 verses last week how God has come to Jonah, spoken to Jonah, and not only is Jonah resisting God's call, but Jonah decides, I'm not going to stay here. God has found me, and I don't want to be found by God. So instead of heading towards Nineveh, Jonah decides to what? Go down to Joppa to catch a boat to Tarshish, which is basically the end of the known world. So not only is Jonah resisting the move towards Nineveh, Jonah's running in the opposite direction. So that's where we are in Jonah's story. Now, let me read for us Jonah 1, 4 through 16. Take a listen. But the Lord hurled a powerful wind over the sea, causing a violent storm that threatened to break the ship apart. Fearing for their lives, the desperate sailors shouted for their gods for help and threw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. But all this time Jonah was sound asleep down in the hold. So the captain went down after him. How can you sleep at a time like this? He shouted. Get up and pray to your God. Maybe he will pay attention to us and spare our lives. Then the crew cast lots to see which of them had offended the gods and caused the terrible storm. When they did this, the lots identified Jonah as the culprit. Why has this awful storm come down on us? They demanded. Who are you? What is your line of work? What country are you from? What is your nationality? Jonah answered, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land. The sailors were terrified when they heard this, for he had already told them he was running away from the Lord. Oh, why did you do it? They groaned. And since the storm was getting worse all the time, they asked him, what should we do to stop this storm? Throw me into the sea, Jonah said, and it will become calm again. I know that this terrible storm is all my fault. Instead, the sailors rowed even harder to get the ship to the land. But the stormy sea was too violent for them, and they couldn't make it. Then they cried out to the Lord, Jonah's God. O Lord, they pleaded, don't make us die for this man's sin, and don't hold us responsible for his death. O Lord, you have sent this storm upon him for your own good reasons. Then the sailors picked Jonah up and threw him into the raging sea, and the storm stopped at once. The sailors were awestruck by the Lord's great power, and they offered him a sacrifice and vowed to serve him. Well, this is a little bit of a cliffhanger intentionally because Jonah has been thrown overboard, and many of us who know the story of Jonah, right, we know what happens next. The whale is coming next week for us. And so we have that one verse at the end of chapter 1 that transitions us into the next phase of Jonah's journey, and we'll get to that next week. But here's what I like to do. There's several things happening in the midst of this story. And so there's just some elements I want to comment on, maybe draw our attention to. And then I want to wrap up our time with 4 observations, 4 big takeaways for me from the text that we read, 2 applications, and then 1 action step. Sound good? So 4 observations are coming, 2 applications, 1 action step. But there's a few other elements I just want to unpack for us. For me, this is, again, one of those stories where you read it and you say, okay, I understand what's happening, but why am I being told this, right? What does this mean? What's the deeper message that Scripture, that the Spirit is trying to communicate here? So again, remember, Jonah is resisting God. He is running away from God. And so he has gone down to Joppa and gotten on this boat and headed out. And what we begin to see is a very interesting contrast. And we begin to see, at least I think, one of, not the only, but one of the key elements, key messages, key focuses of Jonah, which is to challenge our presumption about those who are inside the community of God and those who are outside. So if we think back briefly to the Torah, part of what's happening there is we can't forget, we can't overstate how the Israelites have always been this small I should say relatively small in terms of their neighbors, this small, often overlooked part of the ancient world. And so they have always been in this kind of resistant, this subversive idea that we begin to see God's preference. God so often loves to utilize the small to do the big. And we see this from the very beginning of Scripture with Abraham through the formation of the people of God. And so part of what's happening in the Torah, in the instruction, is not only is it the story of their creation, but a lot of the Levitical codes, a lot of those kind of crazy laws from Leviticus and other parts of the Torah, they're a way of defining what it means to be the people of God. It's a way that they distinguish themselves. Those who are inside the community, those who are a part of the covenant, who are doing God's work in the world, and those who are not. It's a way that they create some difference between them and their neighbors in the ancient world. Well, so one of the things that Jonah begins to do early on in chapter 1 is to challenge our presumptions, and the presumptions even of the ancient audiences of Jonah, challenges our presumptions about who really is inside and who is outside. And more importantly, it reminds us that God, while God is working within the covenant with Israel, it is always for the benefit of the whole world. And this is evocative. It echoes for us God's covenant all the way back in Genesis 22, where we see in 22:18, God says to Abraham that I will bless all the nations through you. Well, we begin to see that Jonah really is a reminder in the midst of that. Let me show you what I mean. So these sailors emerge kind of interestingly. Often sailors get a bad rap kind of stereotypically, right? You curse like a sailor. They're these rough, gruff folks. Even in modern days, right? We're kind of fascinated with sailors. That's why Deadliest Catch was this massive show for years and years and years. So we're just fascinated by sailors. They live this totally different life. And it's easy to sort of write them off as rough people, not interested in God, not spiritual in any way. And what we find is they're actually very pious, very gracious, very concerned with doing right and living right. It's quite interesting. But if we go back and look, part of what's happened beginning in verse 4 is the Lord hurls, I love that, hurls a powerful wind over the sea, causing a violent storm. And what we begin to see too in the midst of this, not only is a distinction being drawn between Jonah and the sailors, but a distinction and really a power struggle is being drawn between Jonah and God. God speaks, God calls, God sends out on mission. Jonah resists. God says go this way, Jonah goes that way. And so God doesn't let it go. God is deeply interested, deeply committed to Jonah, but also deeply committed to the mission he gave to Jonah. He's not going to let Jonah off the hook, nor is he going to leave the Ninevites high and dry. So he pursues Jonah, he hurls. We get this powerful language that God, even in the original language, the way it's organized, it's kind of like it was written in bold, the way that it was arranged, that God hurls with this great power, that God is pursuing Jonah, that God is doubling down on this call in a way. And so fearing for their lives, the desperate sailors shout out to their gods. And this is, we often can overlook this, but in the ancient world, polytheism, the existence of many gods, right, that was the default. So people weren't really surprised, nor did they care that much about the God of Israel. It was just one more God, right? They lived in a world where gods were all around them. So the sailors, they just cry out, they call out to their gods, all in the midst of the chaos. Just as an aside, right? That's one of the unique things that did distinguish both the Israelites and the early Christians, was they claimed monotheism. They claimed that Yahweh, that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was not only the true God, but the one true God. So they claimed monotheism, not just that their God was superior, but that their God was the only God. It really originates, and it was very radical in the ancient world. So we see a little bit of, again, that kind of transition, or contrast, I should say, here. The sailors are doing their best in the midst of the storm. These are seasoned folks, and they are concerned. And that gives us another indication at the ferocity of the storm that has come upon them. So they start praying to anyone and to everyone, fearing for their lives. But Jonah was sound asleep, down in the hold. And this is a really interesting element, just draw your attention to, because we'll continue to pay attention to this. That remember, in the biblical text, direction, geography matters a lot. And so we've talked about before where Jerusalem in the Israelite imagination was viewed as the center. So it was at the high point, the Temple Mount we talk about in the New Testament. That wherever you were in the world, geographically, you always traveled up to Jerusalem. So there's a sense in the biblical text that God is up, that we move upwards towards God. And so what happens? By contrast, we move downwards away from God. So what's happened already in the story of Jonah? He has moved down. He has gone down to Joppa. And now he is going down into the hold of the ship. That Jonah, with his very physical presence, is moving as much as he can away from God. And that's going to continue next week. As what happens? He is thrown out and down into the sea. He continues his running by moving down away from God. The captain wakes him up and says, "How can you sleep at a time like this? Get up and pray." Not get up and help us with the oars, not get up and bail out water, but get up and pray. That these sailors emerge as these very spiritual, sensitive people. They're saying, look, our best hope is prayer. So help us out, Jonah. Get busy praying. What a contrast, right, between these secular sailors and the supposed pious prophet, Jonah. This contrast, right, continues to emerge. So they go back and forth. They eventually cast lots. Jonah says, yeah, it's me. I believe in the God of the Hebrews, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is why it's happening. And he seems a bit indifferent about it, right? Pretty amazingly so. And he says, you know what? Really, your best hope is to get thrown overboard. And at first, we can take that as a bit of this kind of self-sacrificing gesture of Jonah. But there's also that sense, too, where Jonah, his primary concern is getting away from God, right? What better way of getting away from God than just being tossed overboard? Well, the sailors are reluctant, right? They feel responsible for Jonah. They don't want this God of Jonah who is angry to be even more angry at them for killing this follower of God, this prophet of God. And eventually Jonah convinces them. He says, you should go ahead and do it. And they're convinced and throw him overboard. Immediately the storm stops, right? Because God's focus is on Jonah. And so the sailors pass into calm waters, and immediately what do we find? That they have prayed to God, that they have sacrificed to God, and that they have made a vow to God. What a contrast. Again, here's Jonah the prophet, the one who knows God, who's been spoken to and commissioned by God, completely disinterested, moving ever downwards, ever further away from God. And here are these people who don't know anything about this God, but who have eyes to see and ears to hear. That as they learn about this God, they are immediately receptive and convinced. They pray, they sacrifice, they make vows, that they are convinced and become followers in the midst of that. So that's a little bit of a recap of what all is happening here in the midst of Jonah. I think this is particularly powerful as we look back to maybe that original ancient audience, right? Those early folks who were living in exile, and really after the Israelites return to exile, from exile, and live for hundreds of years kind of in the tumultuousness of the ancient world, living through the Greek conquests of Alexander the Great, through the Roman Empire. They are so often battling, resisting conquerors coming through, enemies. It's very clear for them who their enemy is. And yet, the story of Jonah begins to speak to them and say, perhaps your enemies are not quite as bad as you think. Perhaps you should remember that God is interested in them, that God cares about them as well. And that reaches this fever pitch later on in the book of Jonah. So we'll keep our eyes on that going forward. But here for us today, we say, well, this is a good story. Okay, I understand it a little bit better, but how does this speak to me today? I can understand what's happening in the text. I can understand what's happening around the text a little bit in that ancient conversation, that ancient context. But then what about that third level? What about us today? How is Jonah relevant for us today? Well, I'm glad you asked. So I've got 4 observations for us, 2 applications, and then a place of action and practice for us this week. So our 4 observations. First, I think for me, this passage, this portion of Jonah's story reminds me that God is at work in places we least expect. It's so often so easy for me to confuse the fact that what I'm passionate about or where my focus is, that's where God is too, or perhaps that's only where God is. I think quite often God is concerned about the things we are concerned about. God is passionately working in the places that we hope God is. But that doesn't mean that our full focus is God's full focus. And what a great picture here, that God has this amazing way where God comes through even in the midst of our reluctance, and new life is made, right? People are converted, people are changed, and that God is working, pushing us to places we least expect, like Nineveh. Second, for me, another big observation is that God cares about those we often don't care for. God cares about those we don't care for. And God often cares about people we don't like. And that's a hard reality for some of us to come to terms with. That God here is moving towards what? That reality and reconciliation, not just of our group, not just of people like us, people that belong to our community, hold our values or traditions, but God is moving towards the reconciliation and redemption of the whole world. That was a big takeaway for me, that this brought to mind and sort of restarted my focus on Genesis 22:18. God says, through you, Abraham, through you, people of God, I'm working to bless the whole world. That's a key tenet, I think a key charge for us as people that are inheriting the mantle of the people of God. That God is desiring to work through us to redeem and reconcile the whole world. Both people who are like us and who are not, and people we like and people we don't, right? That's part of, I think, God's redemption happening within us. So third, I think that also to me is a great reminder that those with access to religion don't always get it right, and those who hear God don't always listen. Those with access to God, those with access to religious knowledge don't always get it right, and those who hear God don't always listen. That's one of the amazing parts so far of Jonah's story. Here's a person that God speaks to, and particularly in the Old Testament, particularly in the pre-Jesus world, that was uncommon. Now we can go back to Genesis, right? God's preference is to speak. God loves to speak, creates through speaking, and we see through the incarnation that relationship becomes restored, that our ability to speak to God and hear from God is greatly amplified. But in the Old Testament, the ancient world, is pretty rare. And so Jonah is in this amazingly privileged, blessed place. Hears from God. Jonah, go, I'm commissioning you, I'm sending you. And Jonah says, nah, not interested. I'm not interested in doing work among these people. I'm not interested in being a part of your redemptive work, God. Because frankly, I'm pretty upset at them. Frankly, I think they deserve something totally different. That's the subtext of what's going on here. So it's important for us to remember a little bit of humility, right? It's one of the gifts of Christian community. One of the reasons I believe the local church is so important, that we continue to live life, that we continue to hear the word and call of God together, because there's no promise just because we know that we'll get it right, or just because we hear that we'll always do it right. That's a great takeaway for me. Finally, the fourth observation is that some people don't believe simply because they have not heard and have not seen. And I think this is particularly powerful, that we can sometimes take it for granted, right? That perhaps some of us, I continue to to be fortunate to look back and recognize that I was blessed to grow up in a home hearing about faith, being told the stories of faith, seeing parents and a sister live out faith. Not all of us had that. And so it's a great reminder, again, towards humility, towards gentleness, that perhaps, like the sailors, there are people ready and willing. The New Testament often refers to folks like that as people of peace, people who are peacefully receptive to the good news of the gospel, that they just need to hear. They just need to see. They just need to be told those stories. And Jonah's story is a great reminder for me of that. So those are those 4 key takeaways for me, 4 key observations. I'd love to hear what were takeaways for you from this story. But those are the 4 for me. That God is at work in places we least expect. That God cares about those we don't always care for. And God cares about the people we don't always like. That those with access to knowledge or religion don't always get it right, and those who hear God don't always listen. And then 4th, some people don't believe simply because they have not heard and have not seen. I think just a last thought on that is part of, not the fullness, but part of what makes Jonah's reluctance so powerful. That while Jonah is resisting the call to tell people a word from God, even in his reluctance and resistance, the redemptive power of God is when God pursues that, when God enters into that, when God hurls a storm, right? When the power of God is brought to bear even in our reluctance, it has the power to spread the good news of God around us. That's just how remarkable the power of God is. Now, I think if you ask those sailors, and perhaps later, maybe if we ask Jonah, we'll see. Definitely the sailor's preference, and I think God's preference, would be for the reluctance to not be there. But part of what redeems it in a way is God's redemptive character that's brought to bear in Jonah's resistance. So as God hurls a storm onto the sea, and now as the sailors have hurled Jonah into the ocean, we'll see next week what happens. As Jonah's not done traveling down, he's not done resisting and running from God's calling. And so that's really part of the journey for us, for those of us that maybe in our own way have been reluctant to part of God's calling, maybe resistant to part of what God is asking us to do, or who God is asking us to do it among. Great questions for us to consider. But those are my 4 observations. Now here are 2 key takeaways. The first is shorter, the second a little bit longer, and then we'll wrap up with a call to action. But for me, there is both inward and outward transformation that's happening. That the sailors, for instance, the sailors model for us really some healthy spirituality. There is inward turmoil, fear, anxiety, and outward speech, right? And so part of what's happening in this story is the reality that most of our experience, we have to be mindful that our lived experiences, our spiritual experiences, are incarnate. They're meant to be both inward experiences and outward experiences. That the sailors are transformed inwardly, right? Their minds are changed, their hearts are changed, and they express that outwardly through prayer, sacrifice, and vows of commitment to God. And I think for us that's a good reminder, and this transitions into my second application, which is Jonah represents someone with deep knowledge of God that also, let me say it this way. That Jonah represents someone with deep knowledge of God who lacks deep connection to God, that lacks intimacy. And that goes back to, we've talked about this before, the difference between knowing about God and knowing God. That part of that inward and outward transformation is we've got to connect those in a way. Between, as we talked about it several weeks ago in 1 John, the connection between inner transformation and outward action. That renewal here, even in Jonah, that connection, we see the sailors embody it very well. And really, Jonah's reluctance is embodied. He has inner reluctance and outward reluctance too, right? But there's a connection there, and that's important for us. And that's what I wanted to talk to you briefly about. This is sort of my challenge for you, an application coming away from this story, is looking at Jonah's knowledge. Jonah fully understands what God is calling him to do. And I think he understands what he should do, which is he should get up, turn around, and go to Nineveh. But Jonah continues to make conscious choices to remove himself from intimate contact from God. That he chooses not to stay where he was, not where God had found him, where the story began, but to run, to distance himself from that. And it was a great reminder for me that just because we know about God doesn't mean we are intimately connected to God. And I think this is a particular challenge for some of us. I'll say it's a challenge for me. So let me talk to you about that, right? About my challenge. About going from knowing about God to knowing God. Me, my personality, I love information. That's how I develop comfort. It's how I make decisions, as I try and cast a wide net, learn as much as I can, process it, and then make a decision, whether it's about a belief or an action or a dream or whatever it is. I'm just a learner, right? If you're an Enneagram person, I'm a 5. I'm a learner, literally, on the Enneagram. And so I think for some of us, as we talk about loving the Lord our God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, we're just all built differently. And some of those acts of love, acts of pursuing God, are easier than others. For me, it's really easy to love God with my mind. For some of us, maybe it's different, and that's okay. But part of the challenge, part of the danger for us in our faith tradition and in our culture in modern day is that we can settle for learning about God without ever moving towards learning who God is. Knowing about God versus knowing God and being known by God. That we can know all the right things. We can put ourselves in a place to encounter God, but that when we do, what do? We don't choose to move towards God, but rather we move away from God. Let me give you an example, right? This is why I've got this picture here. This is Joy and I. We will have been married 10 years in August, if you can believe it. It's tough for me to believe. But this is one of our engagement photos. So this was us looking younger 10 years ago. But here's a little bit of how this works, right? I'll use a marriage example, but you could replace this with a best friend, maybe, a teammate on a sports team. But there's a difference, right? I learned very quickly. There's a difference in my marriage between knowing about joy and knowing joy. So I can work really hard. I can know a lot of things about joy. I can tell you what flowers she likes. I can tell you what she likes to do for fun, what her favorite music is. I can tell you the things that bother her. For instance, she gets really bothered when dishes don't make their way to the sink or the dishwasher, right? They get left on a counter. Bad news. It really rubs her the wrong way, right? But here's the difference in knowing about joy and knowing joy. It's one thing for me to know that she really doesn't like it when dishes get left on the table or on the counter. It's another thing entirely for me to go put the dishes in the sink. That there is an inherent transition that has to happen between knowledge about someone to knowing that person, to acting upon it, to stewarding that information towards deeper intimacy, right? I can know Joy's favorite flowers. I can know the fact that she grew up in Holland, Michigan, that she loves tulip time that happens every May. But it doesn't do me much good if I know that she loves tulips and I never go out and buy her tulips to remind her that I know her, love her, and care about her, right? Now, the inverse is also true, that I could be trying to be as active, as passionate, as sort of thoughtful a husband as I could be, but if I never took the time to learn about joy, then I would often miss more times than I would connect, right? I would, perhaps if I didn't take the time to remember that she liked flowers, I would never think to buy them, even if I wanted to communicate care and concern, right? So there's an important connection between knowledge about someone and knowledge of someone and how we connect those dots. So we believe, for instance, at King's Cross, that our education, that our learning is important, but we never want to substitute learning about God for learning God. Because as Jonah reminds us, it's not a foregone conclusion. It's entirely possible for us that we can consume all the information we want, learn as much as we can about God or church history or the biblical text, but if it doesn't translate into deeper connection to God, deeper obedience to God, then we've missed the mark. Likewise, we have to be careful that we don't just pursue God in a way that feels good or right to us. We have a responsibility to learn something about God, right? To learn the scriptures, to learn our spiritual practices, to sit in community, to discern together. That connection is incredibly important. So that for me was a huge takeaway, a huge reminder that I've got to check myself. I've got to go back and make sure that not only am I continuing to grow as a learner, am I learning who this God is that loves me and pursues me and calls me to act in the world? Am I learning about that God? But then, is it transitioning into learning, knowing that God and letting myself be known? It's a lot harder than it sounds, at least for me, maybe not for you. My encouragement for you over the next week is to take time once a day and start with 4 minutes, right? Put a timer on your phone, check a clock. Give yourself 4 minutes to enter into conversation with God. Now, the best way to do that is through prayer, but I want to give you 2 options, 2 different ways of doing this, because just as we exist in relationship with each other in different ways, I think God is very open. God's very receptive to interacting with us, speaking to us, and hearing from us in different ways. So my encouragement is spend time once a day for the next 7 days in prayer. Sounds pretty easy, right? But start with 4 minutes a day. And if you really want to push yourself, extend that 1 minute a day. If you extend it 1 minute a day for the next week, you'll wind up with about 10 minutes of prayer in the next week. But as you do that, perhaps prayer's new to you. Perhaps prayer is maybe uncomfortable for you. That's okay. It's a learned relationship. It's something that doesn't always come naturally to all of us, and that's okay. So let me encourage you to do this. One way you can pray is just in conversation. Maybe you go for a walk around your house, or you wake up before kids do, or before you go to work, or before you start your schoolwork, and just talk. Talk and listen. Like any good conversation, say, God, this is where I'm at today. This is who I am. This is what I'm worried about. This is what I'm excited about. This is what I'm dreaming about. And give God some space to speak back, right? To listen. What do you hear? Remember, our God is a God who loves to speak. So maybe just give God the benefit of the doubt. That maybe, just maybe, what you hear in those 4 minutes, what you hear in those 6 minutes, maybe that's God speaking to you. So that's one way. If you're verbal, if you like to have a conversation, just start that discipline this week of transitioning what you know about God to knowing God, and see how it goes. Write it down, take notes, chart it out, and pay attention. Where am I comfortable? Where am I not? Where do I hit a speed bump? What am I surprised about in that way? Now, another way that you can do this, so that's one option, right? Verbal, conversational prayer, so a lot of us are familiar with. Another way you can do this is silently through writing. All right, this is a journal that I've got, and one of the things I was introduced to several years ago is this idea of journaling or dialogic prayer, where you write a dialogue between God and yourself. You start that by saying, Lord, I'm coming to you. I want to have a conversation with you. Meet me in this place. And instead of saying your prayers out loud, you write them down. Say, God, I'm really stressed today. I'm really worried about this. Can you speak to me about it? And so I would write Scott, like I'm writing a screenplay, right? Write that out. God, I'm worried today. I'm concerned today about this. Will you come and speak to me about this? What can you teach me about myself and about you? What can you speak to me about here? And then I prayerfully, peacefully consider writing God's name, Jesus' name, beneath it. Jesus, what do I hear Jesus saying back, right? What do I think Jesus would say to me? And I'll tell you, it's been a remarkable experience for me writing out those dialogues between me and God, that oftentimes in the silence I'm able to hear things or see things that way, and begin to hear back from God. So that would be my encouragement to you. Give yourself 4 minutes to write a dialogue out, thoughtfully, prayerfully coming to God. And be careful, it's not, again, what we hope God is telling us, but taking time to pause and listen for God to speak into us to see what we can learn and hear together. So take time, start with 4 minutes. If you're getting bold and brave, add a minute a day. But take time once a day over the next 7 days to pray and to try and learn not just something about God, but that's good practice. Not just something about God, but to learn and grow in deeper intimacy with God. And let me know what you're finding. Let me know what you learn. We'll get back together and talk more about it. So that's my prayer for you this week. Know that we love you and miss you. We're looking forward, cannot be more excited about moving towards a return, hopefully here in the next few weeks. Continue to please check us out online, our website, Facebook. Check your email, that we'll continue to give more details about our return plan in the days ahead. But just know we're hard at work, anticipating your arrival, anticipating our time together, and we couldn't be more excited about it. We love you and miss you, are praying for you, and we'll see you soon, okay? Have a great week.
Are you hurting, broken within, overwhelmed by the weight of sin? Jesus is calling. Have you come to the end of yourself? Do you thirst for a drink from the well? Jesus is calling. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Leave behind your regrets and mistakes. Come today, there's no reason to wait. Jesus is calling. Bring your sorrows and trade them for joy. From the ashes a new life is born. Jesus is calling. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. as you wait for the crown. Tell the world of the treasure you found.
Well, thanks again for joining us in worship here in our second week in May, our second week in the book of Jonah. We'll be going next week, traveling further down still with Jonah into the belly of the fish, one of the best known parts of Jonah's story. So I hope you'll join us there. I thought what better way as we enter into another week of unknown, of kind of uncharted territory, that we look for one of the Psalms of Ascent, one of the Psalms meant to be sung as people travel up towards Jerusalem and towards the house of God. Whether you are someone this week that is pursuing, that is working hard to know and be known by God, or you're someone that finds yourself reluctant, resistant to who God is and who God is calling you to be, my prayer is that you'll be able to look back and find the presence of God, the peace of God, and the care of God in your life this week. As we get ready to go, hear now these words from Psalm 121, one of the Psalms of Ascent. I look to the mountains. Does my help come from there? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not let you stumble. The one who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel never slumbers or sleeps. The Lord himself watches over you. The Lord stands beside you as your protective shade. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon at night. The Lord keeps you from all harm and watches over your life. The Lord keeps watch over you as you come and go, both now and forever. May you know that comfort. May you know that peace. May you know that security this week. God knows you, God loves you, and God is working for your good. Have a great week. Amen.